Hi there. Welcome to my RSA talk, the UDS security module of the Tesla CAN bus and battery management system. My name is Patrick Kiley. I'm a principal security consultant at Rapid7. Gonna go through, this is a fun talk on some pretty cool research I did on a vehicle that I was able to hack and make faster. And I hope you enjoy it. There'll be some Q&A at the end. In addition, since this is a pre-recorded talk, you're welcome to ask questions during, and I'll be following during the actual presentation. I'll try and answer them as best I can during the talk itself. So the first steps I want to go through, I want to talk a little bit about the architecture of the Tesla Model S and the some of the security components that are relevant to it, as well as my journey to actually do the upgrade and add ludicrous mode to it. So Tesla is a big target for the hacking community. This is a picture taken at the car hacking village at DEF CON a couple of years ago. They're also a very proactive security company. They've got a good bug bounty program. They participate in CanSec West with big prize payouts where they actually give away a Model 3. But the original one, the Tesla that I actually did the work on, had the SoC, the main display that you see on the right in this image. It actually has a hardware level flaw that was the same one that affected the Nintendo Switch. So that was the one that allowed the bootloader to be updated and hacked. And that's one of the big reasons that Tesla did and moved to the Intel Atom-based CPUs on the newer cars, the Model 3 and the newer S and X. So the topics that we're going to cover on this, we're going to go over the architecture. We're going to talk about the process of the ludicrous upgrade, do some firmware analysis, cover logical security on the BMS board, and then go deep into the CAN bus and uniform diagnostics, which is the main kind of meat of the talk, and then follow up with some security recommendations and final notes. So the original Model S, it's an Ubuntu-based Linux system. The autopilot that you see in the picture, the version 3 and newer are actually all Tesla silicon. Earlier versions were NVIDIA-based. It actually has an Ethernet connection between the instrument cluster and the central display, the one that you saw in the previous image. But then there's a security gateway that exists between the Ethernet buses, all the Bluetooth, the cellular connection, and all the individual vehicle controllers. So the security gateway is a pretty important part of the system overall. It's a free RTOS-based system. Again, it sits between the Tegra SoC and the various CAN buses. For example, powertrain, chassis, and body, but it's also heavily involved in the update process. You hear about people, getting new software for the vehicle. The gateway is a component that handles a major part of that update process, and it's the one that actually handles the updating of all the individual CAN connected modules on the vehicle itself. And a really interesting thing about the security gateway is that it actually stores the configuration of the vehicle as a text file. Now, newer versions of this file actually have protections that prevent anyone from changing, but on older versions of software, all you had to do is basically pull this file off the gateway, make some edits, and then upload it back again. So, for example, you can control ludicrous with the performance add on one line. You can turn on and off supercharging. In fact, that's how Tesla disabled it on salvage vehicles, and as well as control the level of autopilot that was actually purchased. So there's a lot of relevant and significant cost changes that you can actually make on that file to do that work. So the battery management system itself, here's kind of a little hardware overview of the unit itself. It uses a DSP TI TMS 320 that runs its own version of software. It's not a Linux based or anything else. It runs the TI code base. And then there's a backup to it, the CPLD, that's the also kind of exists alongside the TI unit that acts as a more hardware backup. There's a current shunt. running just a small STM. And that's an important device that actually measures the amount of current coming from the battery through a very, very small resistor, a very low value resistor. And then there's a pre-charge resistor that is used to prevent damage when the contactor's closed, prevent inrush current damage. And then there's B&B boards on each individual battery pack that also include bleed resistors to allow the packs to get all balanced out. Here's a good image that actually shows all of those individual components. You can see the shunt with the large bus bars, and then there's a small known resistance, and then it just measures the voltage differential between the two of those. There's a sample B&B voltage sense connectors that actually connect to the contactors. There's a positive and negative contactor inside the battery pack. A couple other components. There's a big logic connector that goes outside the battery pack as well. That's the gray connector that you can see on the right here. So how does the Ludicrous upgrade process work? How did I do that? What happened was the P85D was released, and then Ludicrous was the P85D was an aftermarket upgrade or an after purchase upgrade. So the car was around, the car was released for several months, and then they announced the Ludicrous upgrade. But it was significant. It added a half a second to the 0 to 60 time, and it was a $5,000 retrofit or a $10,000 new purchase. But today it's a standard feature. And then by the time of this talk, Tesla claims that the Plaid Model S will actually be the one that's out available. So after a certain window, after a couple of years, it was no longer possible to get a Ludicrous upgrade on an existing P85D. So I took upon the goal to actually reverse engineer that process, because I figured if they actually had that and it was available in the service centers, I might actually be able to figure it out. And it turns out it was really complicated. Like I say, it was a ludicrously foolish endeavor, but luckily I had use of a garage. There was a friend on one of the hacking forums that I got in touch with, and he let me use his garage for the weekend. So what I had to do was bring it there. We dropped the battery pack on it, and then I did the high voltage surgery on it. So what I had to do is drop that battery pack, replace the pyro fuse, which was a safety mechanism with a higher current version, had to replace the contactors, and I had to modify the current shunt. But I also had to do firmware changes, settings to the vehicle, which I kind of covered in the gateway thing, recalibrate the high current shunt. So I showed the picture of that earlier. And then once I was done with the entire process, I managed to brick the vehicle. I couldn't drive it back from California. I had to tow it back. Here's a picture of the fuse on the left and the contactor bay on the right with the old contactors removed. I did some research on what the safety protocols were for doing this, and these were the components you had to buy. You have to buy some high voltage gloves that then use glove protectors. So even though everything's isolated, you can still get yourself quite a bit of nasty shock. So there's a protocol that you have to follow. You want to discharge the battery down to probably about 15 or lower percent. So but there's still a significant amount of voltage in it at around 300 volts. So once the fuse is removed, it separates one half of the pack from the other. But and then after it was all done, I had to do some isolation testing, which is basically making sure that there wasn't anything there to shock me. So what I was actually able to do during all this process is actually figure out how the firmware where it actually works on the Model S. So within the MCU, within the Ubuntu-based system, there are a series of folders that actually store all the firmware for all the various modules, CAN bus modules on the vehicle. So we have the Tegra 3, that's basically just an ARM Cortex. It's the custom Ubuntu. It's a squash file system. But if you can extract that from the system itself, you get to this deploy directory, and then you can actually see all the various firmware components in there. And then the gateway itself has files that identify the vehicle firmware and configuration. So the hardware IDs actually identify all the various modules that are on the vehicle, and firmware.rc is the one that controls, it basically has all the current, all the necessary firmware that's supposed to be running on the vehicle itself for the revision number. So we have a hardware ID and then a revision number. And this firmware RC file was the one that actually got messed up during my Ludicrous upgrade process. I had to manually rebuild that for the BMS value. So when the BMS firmware changed, its firmware, its CRC value changed. I had to recalculate the CRC, upload that to the gateway, and then wake the car back up. So the structure in the file, it actually shows you, okay, so here's the module. It shows the signature value of the firmware itself, and it uses this to actually build the CRC values for that individual module on the vehicle. And so once I extracted that out, figured out the correct firmware that was supposed to be on the BMS unit, I calculated the correct CRC, adjusted the file, and then that's what allowed me to fix it. So what is the individual files, how they are stored, what does that actually look like? And here's a single line from one of the hex files from the battery management system. The other Intel hex files are similar, and this is how the format looks. So first we have a colon as a delimiter. We have the size, address and memory where it goes, record type, and then we actually have the data, and then a small 1-byte checksum. So that's going to become important later when we get into further this. So one of the things I actually wanted to look at when I was digging into this is how well protected is the BMS board itself. So I got a few of these. I was experimenting around on a test bench before I was actually trying this on production, a vehicle that could actually drive, to actually figure out this process before I tried this. And I thought I had everything figured out, but except for that CRC thing that caused me to have to tow a car. But one of the things that I found was on an earlier BMS that I purchased, there was this header that perfectly mirrored the debugging connector used by Texas Instruments for the TMS 320. So that was interesting. It's like, wonder if I can actually connect JTAG and do anything. The other thing that I did was download the data sheet for the TMS 320 and identify where the how JTAG was protected. And there's TI uses something called a code security password. It's a 128-bit password. So not really easily guessable, but let's see if we could find it in firmware. So we can see that it's stored at 7FF8. So what I did is I actually looked in the address portion of this to see if I could actually find the 7FF8. No, we have the code entry point at 7FF6, but 7FF8 was not actually in there. But the CRC value was. That was something I thought that was pretty interesting. Well, what about the bootloader? So during the Ludicrous upgrade process, I figured out I actually had to replace the bootloader. And all the bootloader firmware is stored inside Python source of the Toolbox executable. Toolbox is a diagnostic application used by Tesla to fix the vehicles that are of various issues. And one of the things that it can actually do is if you have the proper version, you can actually flash individual units with various versions of firmware. But the Toolbox Python source that I was actually able to decrypt and pull out actually described the entire Ludicrous upgrade process. So using that in one of the other tools I'll show you in a little bit is how I was actually able to update the bootloader as well as the individual flash firmware on the battery management system. So looking at the bootloader, let's see if I could find the 7FF8, and we did. 7FF8, 128-bit value. Put that into the TI Uniflash program, and boom, we actually unlocked the TMS 320. And for some reason, this took me like half an hour to figure out the fact that they put the keys backwards and start at key 7 and end at key 0. But you put those values in, and you actually are able to unlock the TMS 320. So I was able to do a full memory dump of that and then import it into IDA, which actually supports the TMS 320 as a processor that it can do disassembly on. So here we have 7FF6. It points to the code entry point. For those of you who actually done reverse engineering, finding the code entry point can sometimes be a challenge. But that did it. Then what you actually have to do is manually figure out the assembly language. But that's the full set of code actually running on the BMS, so you have full access to it at that point. So what's the big takeaway from that? Disable JTAG altogether. Not really sure if you can do that on the C2000 series DSP, but having that JTAG password in a piece of code that's used as something as ubiquitous as the service centers, it's more likely to fall into third-party hands. I knew some people that got a hold of it. They were able to share it with me. That's how I found it. And really just, big takeaway from that is maybe just restrict that to factory engineers and limit that as much as possible, because having something completely open like that obviously allows bad people to do stuff when it comes to, modding the vehicles, possibly do dangerous levels. But for me, it was more of an academic exercise. So now we get into the meat of the system itself and how does actually CAN bus work on these Tesla modules. So for those who are not familiar with CAN bus, it's really just like any other bus format. You have a bunch of hex data that gets updated regularly. You have CAN IDs, which are similar to an address, but there's not really a send and receive address unless you get into the higher level protocols. You really just have a bunch of hex values. But there is a format for actually decoding those, and that's called a CAN database or DBC file. It's an open standard. And I was actually able to extract the DBC files from both firmware. So on any vehicle, they have the DBC files, but they're also in Toolbox, which is a little bit easier to work with. So here we have raw CAN data, and now we have decoded DCAN data. And you can see there's a huge difference, just raw hex data that you have to reverse engineer versus everything with all the labels and all the signals decoded for you. So here we have some drive inverter. The DIS and DI are the modules for the drive inverter and the front drive inverter. In the DBC files, I was directly able to import that into Vehicle Spy. That's what you see a screenshot from here. And then you're able to edit it with the, something like the Kvaser DBC editor is a free version that allows you to edit those DBC files and add additional or modify values. So one of the things that I was actually able to do once I got all those DBC files is figure out the power curve of the vehicle. So one of the things that's unique about the Teslas in general is the amount of power available varies based on how hot the battery is and its state of charge. So as to do what's called ludicrous plus mode, what the car actually does is it heats the battery pack up to get it to an optimal temperature to actually give you the maximum amount of power. And you can see there's a huge variance between the, and this is all in Celsius. So 80% state of charge, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to graph all of these variables because I had to heat the battery pack up in addition to charging it at the same time. But the lowest value I had was around 8 Celsius. So at 8 Celsius and 81% state of charge, we had 343 kilowatts. But at full charge and a fully heated battery, we have all the way up to 482 kilowatts, which roughly equates to about 647 horsepower. So. And this was after the ludicrous upgrade that I actually mapped out this power curve. So one of the other things that's unique about UDS is there's a standard. There are protocols that sit on top of it. Sorry, that sit on CAN bus. UDS is a protocol that sits on top of CAN bus, and ODX is a standard for specifying files that use the Uniform Diagnostic Standard to actually do diagnostics or basically tell the CAN bus modules to do things that they wouldn't otherwise normally do. A really important one is 27, which grants security access. But then, 31, routine control, upload, download, read memory. I was able to actually recover all these ODX files also from Toolbox. But the other way you can do it is you can just connect a CAN bus sniffer and capture this data during an upgrade and then decode it. So there are two CAN bus IDs that define kind of send and receive. And then they basically send data back and forth. So if you actually look at this picture, you can see we have 602 and 612 for send and receive. And this is the actual security access routine for Toolbox itself, for the BMS itself. So all Tesla modules, and here's really where we get into kind of the other big thing that we found. This was well known. It just wasn't really talked about as much in conferences and gone into this much detail. But all Tesla modules use a static seed. The static seed is basically just XOR with a value of 35. So you request a seed, and then your response is the XOR 35 value of it. But what the vehicle sends as a seed is 00, 01, 02, et cetera, all the way up through 0F. So the response is basically just the XOR of that. So even the seed itself doesn't change. It's the same from every single vehicle, every single module, throughout all the different firmware versions. It's all static. It's basically the only thing that you could really do that would be less secure is just to not use security access at all. It's a completely static seeding key, or basically like having a static password on this thing. And here's an example of the actual read. You can see, so seed, the key, and then the response, the values to 27. It's showing it's accepted. But it's not all bad news. So the read security by address, which is basically what allows us to do the same thing we did using JTAG, the routine 23 read security by address, that was actually disabled. I tested that, and under several different conditions was not able to get any type of valid response from the battery management system to actually read out memory using the 23 routine. So what I then went through and enumerated all the various routines that were available. And you can see a list of the disabled ones. There's a really good link down here. The Automotive Wiki will actually tell you what ISO 14229 routines are and what they do. And then the ones that I actually was able to get a valid response from, or that I found a valid value in the ODX files, are all listed right here. And there are some pretty cool, interesting ones, which I'll show in a couple of slides. So here's a really important one that was involved in doing the Ludicrous upgrade. Read data by ID, routine 22. And that was to actually read the calibration data for the current shunt that I kind of shown way back at the beginning of the talk. And that's one of the steps that involved is actually recalibrating that, which what that means is you're actually replacing the CGI1, CAU1 data from the shunt using values also extracted from Toolbox. So read data by ID, read the shunt values, and then actually spits this out on CAN bus. And then to recalibrate it, you actually, there's a table of every single P85D BMS. You extract the one for the serial number for the shunt. If you can see that there's a serial number here that's 185-1007. And then you go through and actually write the new values from that table to that shunt as a part of the upgrade process. So that table, that pickle file actually had a value for all the P85Ds. That's, I guess, how they figured out how they would do the make it available. And all extracted from Toolbox. So here's the other interesting thing that kind of was able to reverse. This is how you upload new VMS firmware. And of course, if you just watch a firmware upgrade, as the car is actually pushing new firmware to the car, you can capture all this and see it for all the modules that get upgraded when Tesla pushes new code. So first it does an ECU reset, that's a routine 11. And then it does tester present for a while, which is kind of what you see at the very top, the 3E. Then it opens up a diagnostic session, requests security access, and goes through several iterations of this. This is not an exact sequence, but basically first it erases the old flash, and then it goes through and requests the download and basically writes the new firmware over UDS using those Intel hex files that we see in the BMS. So when we get to the final thing where it's final thoughts, some recommendations that we made. I actually was able to consult with a friend of mine, also head of the Car Hacking Village, Rob Leal from CAN Bus Hack. He provided some good recommendations that I'll be going through in these steps. But the biggest thing is do something other than a static key. Don't use a static key for that security access. Even a simple cryptographic system that moves the ease of access down. AutoSOAR was really a proposal to actually implement encryption across CAN bus, but it's pretty much dead. The manufacturers who actually write and create CAN bus systems basically said it introduces too much latency, but maybe with future CPU architectures, we can actually implement something that's some more encrypted CAN bus. But some manufacturers have actually moved to a PKI-based token. So what happens is if you have to do something really sensitive like remove miles from an odometer or something else that's a really sensitive routine, they issue a PKI-based token that has a long expiration time. So basically you get in contact with the factory, explain what you need it for. They give you a token based on something in the vehicle, some routine that they have built in, and then it'll just have a long expiration time that you have to actually make that change. The other thing that, it's kind of like a standard hardware-based thing, just move all code to a secure boot format, store your root keys securely within the device itself, so it's not on an external flash. Encrypt code transfer. So right now, the hex codes are all sent insecurely. I actually validated that the stuff's running in memory and stuff stored in the hex files is the same value. So if there's a process to actually encrypt that, and then do a little bit stronger authentication on those code transfers, other than because the signature is actually just done upstream before it's actually pushed to the unit. And then just leave the other routines open for normal diagnostics. You can just do all this with existing UDS routines. And then kind of some process changes. Don't store the bootloader in the diagnostic software. It's too sensitive. It contains the JTAG security password. Get it out of there. Have it as special cases for when it's needed, and have your engineering departments handle those. This investigation just kind of really cracked open the case and revealed just a large amount of information of how the architecture of that system worked, just by going through that diagnostic software and digging into the system itself. So it was just a large amount of information that was available in something that was pretty freely available. So some credits, Intrepid Control Systems for the software that they have of both tools and diagnostic software for doing the CAN bus research. Rob Leal for all the UDS and CAN assistance for stuff I didn't understand. Tesla security team, to thank you for letting me do this talk and blessing everything I was talking about here. Thank you to the team that I was working on with the Toolbox reverse engineering. Bitbuster and Rancho Cucamonga, thanks for letting me use your lift. And then I'll leave that disclaimer there. Those are all Tesla trademarks. I'm not associated with or sponsored by Tesla for this talk. Here's a short little screen with some references. This will be available on the media center, so you can actually access those later. And I just would like to say thank you for letting me do this talk and this presentation for RSA 2021.